Good day, everybody. Welcome back to Rocky Mountain Readings. We've been reading the wonderful book, The Talmud, a Biography, and this has just given us the background history of the Talmud all the way back from its early days to the modern era, and it's been quite eye-opening for sure. And I love the line on the bottom of the book: banned, censored, and burned, the book they couldn't suppress. But yeah, certainly history shows a lot of people tried to suppress it, that's for sure. So, shalom, Dave. Welcome. All right, so let's just jump right in. I really think we'll be finishing this book in the next day or two. Yeah, let's jump in. We're on chapter 14 today, the problem with emancipation. So, yeah, we're all the way up into the 17th century, which is very cool. So, the problem with emancipation. When we were young, we were treated as men. Now that we have grown old, we are looked upon as babies. Pioneers. The origins of the Jewish community in Charleston, South Carolina, date back to 1695. It is the oldest in North America. In the early 19th century, it was also the largest, the most sophisticated, and most comfortable. Its members lived alongside their neighbors in a state of happy emancipation. The Talmud had never been much on their minds. Most of them had probably never even seen a copy. There were no rabbis, as far as anyone knows, in America at this time. It was a country of pioneers, attracting only the most adventurous souls. And I think this is very relevant for Noahites today, because we're in that pioneering stage, and we need to see it for what it is and how successful roots get dug in, for sure. Traditionalists tended to stay back in Europe, where they were used to the way things were done. But although they weren't thinking about the Talmud, the inhabitants of Charleston were by no means cut off from their co-religionists in Europe. They had heard about reforming currents that were beginning to circulate in Germany, continuing emancipation, and the new ways of thinking which Moses Mendelssohn had encouraged were bringing fresh ideas to the fore. Traditionalism was under threat in Europe, and post-revolutionary America was certainly no place for musty conservatism, particularly if it stood in the ways of social and economic advancement. The old ways were changing, and even though in Charleston the connection to the old ways was already tenuous, a formal commitment to progress felt like a good thing. In 1824, a group of Charleston Jews established a Reform Society of Israelites. Their aim was to reform the synagogue service, to make it more intelligible to the English speaker, and to expunge the erroneous doctrines of the rabbins. They weren't particularly motivated by a disregard for or a dislike of the Talmud. It's just that they felt that their prayer service was in need of modernization. But their desire to change the prayer service was the practical consequence of an ideological struggle that was taking place back in Europe, particularly in Hamburg, where the seeds of the Charleston campaign had been sown. And in Hamburg, indeed across most of Germany, the Talmud sat at the heart of the conflict. A time to change. The reform movement began, as these things do, not as a formal enterprise, but as a result of a small number of innovations, largely uncoordinated, but all heading in the same general direction. Very important point. I want to highlight that for sure. The French and American revolutions of the 18th century had created the conditions for the political emancipation of the Jews, a gradual process which unfolded throughout the latter part of the 18th century and most of the 19th. As part of this process, Moses Mendelssohn, despite his steadfast commitment to traditional Jewish practice, had unbarred the gates which had kept the Jews far from the world culture and learning. His translation of the Bible into German was a deliberate strategy to encourage the people of the Talmud to learn the language of those amongst whom they lived. It gave them the tools to explore the great literary heritage of Germany, and that in turn had a stirring effect upon their outlook. Now, looking back, also, we've got to say what that eventually did is caused the Reformation caused a lot of commingling, and you've seen a lot of Jewish folks marrying outside of Judaism, and some even say that played a role in the Holocaust. They say at the time of the Holocaust that 80% of the Jews in Germany were intermarried. And yeah, I mean, Rabbi Chaim Kaufman, who I do broadcasts with, he is Columbia University graduate with a major in World War II history. And, to hear him cite stats like 80%. So there's positives with that Reformation, so they say, but from the Jewish perspective, it turned out to be almost heresy as far as orthodoxy is concerned today. From the late 18th century, there was a growing feeling amongst more worldly, socially acculturated Jewish circles that their religious practices were archaic, out of step with the spirit of the age. This was most immediately noticeable in the synagogue service, which was unintelligible to those without a grasp of Hebrew, and which lacked the decorum and musical solemnity of the great churches. Here and there in Amsterdam, in Szczecin, and Kassel in northern Germany, and ultimately in Hamburg, congregations were established which did things differently. The practices they instituted did not conform to the traditions of the Talmud, but nor were they, in the early days, intended as anti-Talmud. Indeed, the reformers aspired to demonstrate the Talmud's support for their motivations. They even engaged a Talmudic scholar to champion their cause. The reform movement grew quickly. By the 1840s, congregations across Germany, France, Hungary, and Austria were experimenting with innovation. They introduced prayers in German into the synagogue service, brought in organs, and instituted sermons. They modified stringencies around Sabbath observance and the dietary laws. They appointed a different type of rabbi, men with secular education who had spent little or no time in the yeshiva. Now they even, have women rabbis. At a conference in Brunswick in 1844, Samuel Holdheim, one of the leading intellectual lights of the movement, poured scorn on the earlier attempts in Hamburg to use the Talmud to justify their innovations. The Talmud, he urged, had only enjoyed legitimacy in its own time. These days it was no longer authoritative. A schism was in the making. Yeah, don't turn on your roots. A time to refrain from changing. Traditional Talmudists did not sit idly by as the reform movement grew in popularity. The Rabbinic Council in Hamburg, traditionalists to a man, wrote to the leading light of their generation, Moses Sofer, asking for his support in their campaign against the innovations of the Hamburg Temple. Moses Sofer believed passionately in the intrinsic worth of every aspect of Talmudic life. His conservatism was not driven by fear of change. Rather, it was a deep commitment to the values of am I missing a page? To the values of tradition, encapsulated in his motto, innovation is forbidden by the Torah, a pun on the Talmudic injunction that the new grain harvest is forbidden by the Torah before an offering is brought to the temple. Sofer applauded the ban that the traditionalists had imposed upon the use of Reform prayer books and musical instruments in the synagogue. He then embarked on an unrelenting strategic campaign against the Reform movement and the religious Enlightenment. He mustered rabbis of every temperament, not just the most conservative rabbis, to contribute to a collection of letters arguing against reform. He appealed to the nationalist aspirations of the masses in condemning the reform movement's abolition of Hebrew as the language of prayer. He strengthened the traditionalist ties with the Habsburg authorities, established the largest yeshiva in Europe in his hometown of Pressburg, and whenever a prestigious rabbinic post fell vacant, he tried to install one of his best and brightest pupils. In his ethical will, he condemned Mendelssohn's work and warned his students never to yield to the pressure to change their traditional language, clothes, or names. And let's face it, that's what kept them and sustained them in in Egypt. They didn't change their language, they didn't change their names, they didn't change their dress, nor did they intermarry. Sofer's defense of the old Talmudic ways was unyielding, but it didn't suit everyone in the traditional camp. There were many who were receptive to the changing world, but not to the same extent as the reformers. They didn't want to be part of the movement heading towards the rejection of the Talmud. Reform was too radical for them, and Moses Sofer's traditional orthodoxy was too unyielding. They didn't know it yet, but they were waiting for a new champion to come along. Dueling friends. In 1829, two young men met at the University of Bonn. They'd previously been introduced to each other in Frankfurt. Now they began to strike up close friendship through their university activities. Both men shared a passion for igniting the religious commitment of those German Jews who were drifting away from their faith, seduced by a new and exciting modern world. But each man would set about it in a fundamentally different way. The older of the two, Samson Raphael Hirsch, dreamed of inspiring new ways of approaching the Talmud that would draw on all the benefits that the secular education could offer. The younger Abraham Geiger was convinced that the Talmud simply reflected a moment in history. It was part of an ongoing development of Jewish law and practice, not an unchanging expression of the will of heaven. In 1835, Hirsch laid out plans for a book which would interpret the Bible's teaching on human density and explain the underlying moral purpose of Talmudic law. One of his friends showed the book's outline to a German publisher who said that he wasn't sure there would be a market for such a lofty volume. Perhaps the author could try out his ideas in something smaller first. If that sold well, then he was sure that he would be able to find a publisher to take on the whole project. So Hirsch wrote a book in the shape of a fictional correspondence between a student and a young rabbi, in which the student set out the religious issues that were troubling him, and the rabbi responded. He wrote it under a pseudonym and called it the 19 Letters. It was an instant hit. Hirsch had put his finger on exactly the questions that were bothering people, not just religious questions, but social and national issues too. The book struck a chord because Hirsch provided modern ethical reasons for the things the Talmud expected them to do. He didn't treat the laws as the outcomes of fated discussions in ancient Oriental academies, but as a means of making sense of life in modern 19th century Europe. The success of the 19 Letters enabled Hirsch to write the book that he had originally planned, and over the course of his life, many more besides. By explaining what he saw as the reasons that underpinned religious practice, he was able to remove the artificial barriers that time had erected between the Talmud and the wider world. In Hirsch's system, the fully rounded student of Talmud is a student of life, willing and able to investigate and respond to all branches of human knowledge. Hirsch was not just driven by an ideological passion, he was deliberately trying to stem the tide of reform. His slogan, Torah with worldly involvement, became the motto for generations of secularly educated, culturally assimilated, religiously observant Talmudic students. Hirsch didn't achieve his goal of eliminating the reform movement, but he did provide a platform for those who wished to integrate a traditional lifestyle with the modern world. The reason he didn't halt the reform movements in its tracks is due to no small part to Abraham Geiger, the friend of his youth, with whom he was to fall out so badly. Geiger's response to the 19 Letters was severe. He attacked the dog-like obedience of those who observe the Talmudic commandments, likening it to idolatry. It was the end of his friendship with Hirsch. Small, with long, straight, shoulder-length hair tucked behind his ears, 2-inch sideburns, and wireframe glasses, Abraham Geiger cut a striking pose. He had grown up in a strictly observant household and had delivered a Talmudic discourse at the age of 13, but, according to one of his biographers, shortly after his death, he became utterly disgusted with the Talmud. Or shortly after his father's death, he became disgusted with the Talmud. Unfortunately, the biographer does not speculate on why this may have been and whether it was connected with his father's passing. Hirsch was interested in the thought and philosophy that underpinned his faith. Geiger was concerned with its development and history. Intellectually, he should have been destined for a university's chair, but such positions were not open to Jews in the 19th century Germany, and he was left with little choice other than to become a rabbi. This decision cast him straight into the bear pit of religious conflict. His first application for a rabbinic post was vetoed by traditionalists in Breslau, who, aware of his anti-Talmudic learnings, accused him of being a Karaite or Sadducee. His early rabbinic career was dogged by lack of advancement due to the efforts of more traditional colleagues. And isn't that the way the world works? Opposition stands everywhere. The reform movement that Geiger conceived was more than a reaction to overlong, unintelligible synagogue services and seemingly petty restrictions. He strove to develop a coherent theology of reform. He argued that centuries of studying the Talmud in enclosed monastic ghetto communities had led an excessive legalism in Jewish practice. The only way to rediscover the ethical underpinnings of the faith was to return to a time before the Talmud, to the liberalizing democratic spirit of the early Pharisees. But at this stage in his life, Geiger worked as a rabbi, not as an academic. And like all men of the cloth, he wasn't able to spend enough on intellectual pursuits. Real life gets in the way. In Abraham Geiger's case, real life was an event half a world away. In a city he had never visited, it threw him off his guard just as he was taking up his first rabbinic post. The Damascus Affair. In 1840, Padre Tommaso, an elderly Italian monk, and his servant disappeared in Damascus. He had visited the Jewish quarter of the city on the day he had vanished. Rumors began to spread in the Christian district that he had been ritually murdered by the Jews. The accusations never end. The authorities arrested 12 Jews and tortured them to gain a confession. 4 suspects died as a result of the torture. 1 converted to Islam, and the remainder were incarcerated awaiting execution. The case was unusual for several reasons. Accusations of ritual murder against the Jews in Muslim countries were relatively rare. Even on those few occasions when Christians in the Ottoman Empire had stirred up the old blood libel charge against the Jews, the authorities refused to pursue it. But Syria was no ordinary Ottoman country. Its government was in revolt against the empire and was maneuvering to win European allies, particularly France, through the support of its Christian subjects. The French consul got involved, and the affair was picked up by the European media. It became something of a cause célèbre. It dominated the headlines in Europe for weeks. In a show of solidarity with the captives, the Jewish communities of England and France sent Sir Moses Montefiore and Adolphe Crémieux, 2 high-profile, well-connected community leaders to Syria. Meetings were held, and within a month, the surviving Jewish prisoners were released. Neither Padre Tommaso, his servants, nor their abductors were ever found. The incident was the catalyst of an outpouring of anti-Jewish feeling in the European media. The influential Leipziger Allgemeine Zeitung dramatically announced that the 3 rabbis had been imprisoned with orders to translate the Talmud so that their secrets of the Jewish religion could be discovered. The Times in London devoted large amounts of space to discussions of whether the Talmud prescribed ritual murder. A pernicious but unsigned piece in the Times, purporting to be written by a convert from Judaism, repeated the old charges of ritual murder and laid the blame squarely at the feet of the Talmud. It was not tolerant, post-Enlightenment Europe's finest hour. The Academic Talmud. In his final years, Abraham Geiger managed to obtain an academic post as the head of a new rabbinic college in Berlin. It was a fitting appointment, for he wasn't just the leading theologian of the German Reform movement. He was also one of the leading lights in a new secular enterprise inspired by the religious enlightenment and the work of men like Moses Mendelssohn. It was known as Wissenschaft des Judentums, the scientific study of Judaism. It would lead a century later to the establishment of Jewish studies faculties at universities throughout the world. The Wissenschaft movement was both the product of the Haskalah, the religious enlightenment movement, and a reaction to it. It was the product of enlightenment inasmuch as it is treated Judaism as any other cultural phenomenon, using scientific methodology to investigate its history, culture, and development. It was a reaction to it because growing acculturation was creating a new kind of Jew, one with little or no interest in their religious heritage. Wissenschaft, which separated scholarship from belief, had in theory no religious axe to grind. It provided a means for assimilation. It provided a means for assimilated Jews to reconnect with their cultural heritage. The new science subjected the Talmud to detailed critical scholarship. As Mark Shapiro points out, traditional Talmud scholars had always tried to resolve difficulties in the Talmud text by referring to or even proposing alternative readings, but their new critical scholars went far further than this. They actively collected and compared as many variant sources as possible, assessed the Talmud's language against other Semitic tongues, and reevaluated its understanding of history, medicine, and the natural world. Even its relation with the Mishnah was challenged. It may have been the core text upon which the Talmud was a commentary, but in 1861, Hirsch Mendel Pinelez challenged the fundamental principle that it was the authentic interpretation of the Mishnah. His book claimed to defend the Mishnah against the many of the misinterpretations that sought to demonstrate had been made by the Talmud. Even Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, who hated the Jews, was caught up in the Wissenschaft endeavor, though not as he intended. During his reign, Nicholas had made life as difficult as possible for his Jewish subjects, expelling them from their homes, forcibly drafting young boys into the army from the age of 12, keeping them there for a minimum of 25 years, frequently snatching them from the streets or kidnapping them from their homes. He passed legislation banning them from the major cities and herded them into villages in the place of settlement, a strip of land running from the Baltic to the Black Sea, taking in large chunks of Lithuania, Poland, and the Ukraine. He set up a network of schools with the avowed aim of bringing them nearer to the Christians and to uproot their harmful beliefs, which are influenced by the Talmud. In 1841, Nicholas commissioned a report which concluded that the Talmud was the reason the Jews refused to assimilate into Russian society. He decided that the only way to expose the Talmud was to have it translated so that people could see what it really was. He offered large sums of money to anyone who could translate it. In Germany, Ephraim Moses Piner had already drawn up plans to translate the Talmud into German. He wanted to make it accessible to German-speaking Jews and to counter the accusations of its opponents. He applied to Nicholas for funding for his project, and Nicholas assented, assuming that Piner would provide the condemnation of the Talmud that he sought. In 1842, the first volume appeared. Nicholas purchased 100 copies. The kings of Prussia, Holland, Belgium, and Denmark also bought copies. When Nicholas discovered that Piner had produced a direct translation, which didn't seek to distort or polemicize against the Talmud, he was furious. He withdrew his funding. No further volumes appeared. Isn't that the way a lot of derogatory behavior functions? Hirsch Mendel Pinel's defense of the Mishnah and Piner's desire to make the Talmud accessible to those who couldn't understand the original were just two of the many endeavors in the growing field of academic Talmud scholarship. Over the course of the 19th century, new tools appeared, all designed to facilitate critical scholarship. Amongst the most important were Raphael Rabinowitz's 1867 comprehensive listing of all the variant readings contained in known Talmudic manuscripts and printed versions, and Marcus Jastrow's dictionary. Jastrow wasn't the first to try his hand at writing a dictionary. The German scholar Wilhelm Gesenius had produced a Latin lexicon in 1815 that was subsequently translated into English. But Jastrow's work, which gives Talmudic examples for each word, remains the standard study aid for English-speaking Talmud students even today. Important. Academic Talmudic scholarship wasn't confined to Jews. It attracted the attention of missionary Protestant Franz Delitzsch and his students. Delitzsch was a Lutheran Bible commentator with a profound knowledge of and a keen interest in rabbinic literature. His knowledge proved to be the downfall of August Rolling, a priest and professor of Hebrew literature at Charles University in Prague. In 1871, Rolling published The Talmud Jew, an annotated collection of quotations allegedly made from the Talmud. Unfortunately, he made all the quotations up, and it was quite clear that his intention was nothing other than scurrilous. Rolling compounded his stupidity when, called as a witness in a blood libel trial. He came out with old calumny that the Talmud instructed Jews to use Christian blood in their rituals. Joseph Bloch, a young rabbi soon to become a member of the Austrian parliament, called Rolling a fraud and offered to pay him 3,000 florins if he could translate a page of the Talmud. Rolling, who wasn't up to the task, tried to avoid the challenge by suing for libel. Bloch called upon Franz Delitzsch, who comprehensively refuted Rolling's polemic. Rolling dropped the case before it came to court, was forced to pay costs, and was suspended from his university chair. In 1878, August Wunsch, a student of Delitzsch, translated passages from the Talmud, and in 1887, Hermann Strack, a Protestant missionary and professor of Old Testament at Berlin University, published his introduction to the Talmud. Strack's book has been enlarged and reprinted several times. It remains a classic work for academic Talmud scholars today. Rolling was also indirectly responsible for the first full German translation of the Talmud. At the same time, gradual emancipation was making people more politically aware, active, and organized. Karl Marx's writings were being discussed, workers' groups were meeting and agitating, Zionism was on the agenda, news of pioneers who were rebuilding the homeland was firing imaginations, particularly amongst the young. If that wasn't distraction enough, there were economic pressures, industrialization, urbanization, and ever-growing waves of immigration to the utopias of the United States and Northern Europe. Set against a background of anti-Semitic legislation, persecutions, and pogroms, it's little wonder that the long-established Talmud-based system of education was crumbling. In the yeshivas, traditionally and exclusively dedicated to Talmud study, students were becoming politically aware, often without the knowledge and approval of the teachers. Many yeshivot themselves were changing. A new impetus towards ethical education was gaining. Cincinnati held a banquet to celebrate their first ever graduation ceremony. By this time, a number of Jews in the USA had swelled considerably. The Reform movement was still dominant, but it now catered for many tastes, from out-and-out rejectionists of the Talmud on one wing to traditionalists on the other. Neil Gilman describes it as the American Reform Coalition. The college invited the movement's leading lights to the banquet. As the first diners took their seats, some could be seen shaking their heads in disbelief, turning and murmuring discontentedly to their neighbors. As more diners fled into the room, the murmur turned into a hubbub. Finally, a good number of red-faced, furious-looking people stormed out of the room. One man waved the menu card in the air, yelling, "This is a disgrace." The printed menu for the 9-course banquet had been on the tables when they entered the room. On it were clams, crab, and shrimp, which are all non-kosher, all of which are specifically prohibited in the book of Leviticus. The main course was beef, and the dessert, cheese and ice cream, a combination of meat and milk dishes, the prohibition of which was so ancient that even the Talmud takes it for granted. The walkout in Cincinnati was when the Talmud in the USA started to fight back. The fight intensified a few years later when a conference of Reform rabbis in Pittsburgh declared allegiance only to the moral laws of Judaism, rejecting Talmudic legislation as apt to obstruct rather than further modern spiritual elevation. In a deliberate secession from the Reform movement, the traditionalists announced the creation of a new rabbinical seminary in New York based on the conservative principles known as the Jewish Theological Seminary. Its constitution declared its commitment to historical Judaism as expounded in the biblical and Talmudic writings. The curriculum was to combine traditional Talmud study with Wissenschaft subjects, including Jewish philosophies, history, and literature. In 1901, the seminary governors persuaded Solomon Schechter to leave the hollow tranquility of Cambridge University in England to take up the position of president. Born into a Hasidic family in Romania, Schechter had been brought up in a traditional Eastern European yeshiva before moving to Berlin, where he was drawn to the Wissenschaft school. Academically oriented and traditional in outlook, he attracted a circle of similarly minded scholars to the seminary, many of them recent immigrants from Europe. He laid the foundations for the seminary to become one of the world's leading centers of Talmudic research and study for most of the 20th century, but the scene of his greatest achievement was neither Romania, Berlin, Cambridge, nor New York. It was back in the alleys of Cairo. The Cairo Geniza. In 1896, Mrs. Agnes Smith Lewis and Mrs. Margaret Dunlop Bishop, twin sisters now widowed, traveled to Egypt. They'd been there before. Both women were accomplished scholars, able to read Greek, Syriac, Arabic, and Hebrew. On a previous visit to the Middle East, they had discovered a 5th century Syriac gospel, the leaves of which were being used as butter dishes in the refectory of St. Catherine Monastery on Mount Sinai. On this trip, they were in Cairo market when a vendor offered them some pages from a Hebrew manuscript. On their return to England, they showed them to Solomon Schechter. He realized they must have been torn from a Hebrew version of the book of Ecclesiasticus, or Ben Sira, which previously had only been known in Syrian or Greek translations. Ancient Hebrew documents had been circulating in Cairo for a number of years. Several had manuscripts are still being analyzed. They have helped to explain many obscure or corrupted Talmudic passages and have thrown light on life and conditions in ancient Egyptian communities. When he arrived in New York, Schechter would have encountered people who reminded him of the family he had left behind in Romania. Waves of immigration from Eastern Europe had brought many strictly observant families to the city. Their style was very different from those with a cultured German or English background. They'd come from rural towns and villages where traditional Talmud study had been the norm, and the new ways of thinking an oddity. In New York, they found that the reverse held true. They couldn't make any sense of reform at all. Even Schechter's Jewish Theological Seminary seemed too radical. But this was America, and even the most traditionalist methods of Talmud study couldn't completely avoid change. The immigrants set up their own seminary on the Lower East Side and adopted the latest method of study, which had been developed in the Lithuanian tradition, once pioneered by the Volozhin Yeshiva. This method, even more analytical than its predecessors, had met with considerable opposition when first introduced in Europe by Chaim of Brisk. Whereas traditionalists were interested in studying the Talmud to determine practical law, the Brisker method was focused purely on analysis of the argument. Students tended only to study those volumes of the Talmud where the keenest argumentation was found. On one occasion, Chaim of Brisk was grappling with a difficult legal problem. He wrote to Isaac Elkanan Schechter, after whom the New York yeshiva would be named, gave him all the facts and asked for his ruling. But he insisted that the Schechter was not to tell him his reason. For he was happy to defer a practical decision, but he didn't want to know the reasoning behind it. In cases, he was tempted to review it and reach a different conclusion. The Talmud was now well and truly embedded in America. As events unfolded, it became clear that it had crossed the Atlantic just in time. Events in Germany were about to put an end to its 1,000-year sojourn in Europe. For the next half a century, America was to be its most important home, but Europe still had one major contribution to make: a page a day. A young man stood up at a conference of traditional rabbis in Vienna in 1923. Meir Shapiro was a highly accomplished orator. He sat in the Polish parliament, and he was a rabbi of a smallish town in southeast Poland. He had won acclaim in parliament for a detailed plan he submitted to reform the Polish economy. But his abiding passion was education, particularly its improvement and reform. He would soon found a Talmud academy in Lublin that would become renowned not just for its rigorous curriculum, but also for its inspiring physical environment, which he felt was essential for successful study. Meir Shapiro told the conference that he was concerned about two aspects of contemporary Talmud study. One, that it was accessible only to an elite who had the opportunity and educational background to enroll in a yeshiva and spend years studying there. The other, that only a small number of volumes were studied, notably those which lent themselves to detailed analytical investigation. Shapiro's suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity and far-reaching in its outlook. He proposed setting up study groups for lay people in which one page of the Talmud would be studied each day. The 2,700 pages of the Talmud would take nearly 7.5 years to complete and would involve a commitment from participants of around an hour a day. It just shows you little by little you can get through big, massive volumes. It was a significant commitment, but it was achievable. It would bring the Talmud to a much wider audience and bind its world together. The same page would be studied on the same day everywhere. Travelers would be able to continue their studies wherever they went. Shapiro's plans didn't go down well with everyone. His nameless, the ultra-conservative Chaim Eliezer Shapira, a Hasidic leader in the Transylvanian town of Munkatz, opposed it on the grounds that it was a deviation from traditional methods of learning. That in any case, topics did not end neatly at the bottom of each page, and perhaps most pertinently, it was an initiative of those who supported the Zionist cause, to which the Munkatz Hasidism were firmly opposed. But Meir Shapiro's proposal was agreed by the conference, and in 1924, the first cycle of what became known as the Daf Yomi, or daily page, program began. It was to become perhaps the most significant and certainly the most democratizing Talmud initiative of all time. But that wouldn't happen until long after the rise and downfall of Nazi Germany. A new world in the making. Hillel said, "If I am not for me, who will be for me? When I am for me, what am I? And if not now, when?" This is one of my favorite Mishnahs. I think it's from chapter 3. Destruction. The problems began even before the Nazis came to power in 1933, but accelerated sharply thereafter. Nazi bans on the ritual slaughter of meat, the forcible closure of Jewish shops, and other measures designed to deny the Jews a livelihood led to profound dilemmas for Talmudists whose entire worldview was founded on strict religious observance. Could the laws restricting work on Sabbath or regarding the slaughter of meat be modified? And even if they could, would this be desirable? Or would it lead to an unleashing of the floodgates and increasing destruction of religious life, handing the Nazis the victory they wanted? The Rabbinic Seminary in Berlin, which prided itself in producing Talmudic scholars who had also received a general education, was condemned when it made plans to relocate with its students to Tel Aviv. Esriel Heidesheimer, the inspiration behind the college, was accused of abandoning his people. The seminary existed to produce rabbis for the German community, and now, in the darkest hour, it was threatening to leave. He was also strongly criticized by conservative Eastern European rabbinic leaders. They had only tolerated the college's embrace of secular studies as a bulwark against German reform. They strongly disapproved of his taking what they saw as a fundamentally heretical curriculum to Israel, where there was no reform presence. Heidelsheimer, although not answerable in any way to the conservatives, revoked his plans. The Talmud remained in Berlin. As conditions worsened, Leo Abayak, the great philosophically minded leader of German reform, predicted the end of 1,000 years of Jewish life on German soil. Nevertheless, he refused to leave Germany, electing to stay with his people until at last he was deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. The Talmudist Jehiel Jacob Weinberg didn't agree with Bayek's prediction. The Talmud knows nothing of finality. There are many ways of addressing a problem. 70 years on, we can see they were both right. It was indeed end of Jewish life on German soil until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the beginning of an astonishing revival. The rise of Nazism led to a bout of soul-searching for those who held firm to Samson Raphael Hirsch's approach of including secular study alongside the Talmudic education. Many German Jews could no longer see anything of value in a culture which could spawn the evil of Nazism. In the end, events took control. On November 7th, 1938, Herzl Gernspan, a 17-year-old Polish Jew who had heard that his parents had been expelled from Germany, shot a German diplomat in the Paris embassy. On the 9th of November, a coordinated action by Nazi stormtroopers and Hitler Youth across Germany destroyed close to 300 synagogues, shattered the windows of 7,500 Jewish commercial properties, looted the buildings, slaughtered 91 people, and transported 30,000 people to concentration camps. It became known as the Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The Berlin Seminary never opened its doors again. 11 million people were slaughtered by fanatic, ruthless Germanic efficiency. 6 million of them were Jews, rounded up and herded into death camps. Their possessions, books, in many cases, all records of their existence were destroyed along with them. 2/3 of the entire Jewish population of Europe were slaughtered. Amongst the most heart-rending accounts of Talmudic life from that time, one of the few textual witnesses to survive is Rabbi Ephraim Oshry's remarkable record. He was one of 25,000 souls who were driven into the tiny ghetto of Kovno, Lithuania, when the Nazis invaded in 1941. The ghetto was liquidated in 1944 when the advancing Russian army, breathing down their necks, the fleeing Nazis transported as many of its inhabitants as they could to death camps and murdered most of the remainder on spot. Rabbi Oshry survived. His wife and children did not. Oshry served as a spiritual guide to those in the ghetto. People would approach him daily with their problems and questions. He tore scraps of paper from wherever he could to record everything they asked and all his responses. He hid the scraps. Following the war, he published 5 volumes of his record. Among the questions he was asked was whether it was permissible to pressurize someone to try to save another person's life, knowing that they may not succeed and may little better. They may not succeed and may little better than the concentration camps. Some were even set up on site of former Nazi camps. The refugees incarcerated in the death camps struggled to rebuild their lives. For the Jews, education was ever a priority. The younger children had never been to school. Their older siblings had been torn away from their studies. They needed books of all types, including copies of the Talmud. There were none to be found. A group of rabbis approached the commander of the American zone in Germany and asked the U.S. Army to help in obtaining copies of the Talmud. A survivor of the Dachau camp and former chief rabbi of the Lithuanian army, Rabbi Samuel E. Snag, suggested that copies be printed in Germany. The American Joint Distribution Committee sent 2 copies from the U.S., and the U.S. Army commandeered an old German printing plant in Heidelberg. 100 copies of what became known as the Survivor's Talmud were printed on presses that the Nazis had used to print their propaganda. It was a small but welcome irony, the people of the Talmud printing their ancient tome on presses belonging to the villains who had tried to destroy them. It was a pity the architect of their destruction was no longer alive to witness the humiliation. A new beginning. The Talmud hadn't been destroyed, but its environment would never be the same again. The European yeshiva and seminaries were gone. With Eastern Europe under Soviet control, there was neither will nor opportunity to rebuild them. Yeah, and I've talked to some friends in Lithuania about the environment that they grew up with no religion, and they said there was old churches there, but nobody was allowed to attend, and their parents never went, and that was the environment they grew up in. Nobody knew anything about religion, but yet to see the bright minds today, even being instilled in areas like that, hungry for Torah. Yeah, beautiful. With Eastern Europe under Soviet control, there was neither will nor opportunity to rebuild them. The teachers and students who had survived were traumatized and broken. They could see no future. From one tiny corner of the globe, a ray of hope glimmered. The United Nations had voted to grant independence to the state of Israel. It wasn't an easy birth. War broke out with its Arab neighbors on the day the state was founded, and further population upheaval began as communities in the Arab-speaking world overnight found themselves unwelcome in the lands where their families had lived for generations. In 1941, just before the Nazis arrived, students from the yeshiva in the Polish town of Mir had managed to obtain exit visas from the Soviet occupiers. Unable to flee westward into Nazi-dominated Europe, they had enlisted the aid of the Japanese and Dutch consuls in Vilna, who managed to get them entry visas to the Caribbean island of Curaçao. 400 of them traveled across Russian by the Trans-Siberian Railway to Japan. They never made it to Curaçao. The Japanese, who were fighting alongside the Germans, moved them to Shanghai, and in 1943 forced them into a ghetto. But they did survive, unharmed. In 1946, when travel became possible again, they left, arriving first in the U.S. and finally reestablishing themselves in Israel. A few other old European yeshivas were also reincarnated in Israel or the U.S. These countries followed traditional Jewish interpretation to neglect the centuries of excessive study of the Mishnah and Talmud. To neglect the centuries of extensive study of the Mishnah and Talmud would, he wrote, be as presumptuous as it is precarious. 30 years earlier, Rabbi Travers Herford, a Unitarian minister, Travis Herford, a Unitarian minister in Manchester, had published Christianity and Talmud and Midrash. He judged the Talmud to be a consistent and logical endeavor to work out a complete guide to the living of a perfect life. He trawled the Talmud and associated rabbinic literature, seeking out every reference to Jesus and Christianity, which there's none, and finding many more than there actually are. Yeah, make it all up as you go along. Although his work appears today to be a little overeager and uncritical, the scholarship which he applied in an age when a 2 million word text could not be searched digitally is formidable. Herford's passion and the subject of his major works was the literature and outlook of the early Talmudic Pharisaic period. His slightly older contemporary, George Footmore, a Presbyterian pastor and professor of history of the history of religion at Harvard concentrated on the Bible and on the origins of theology and religion. He wrote a 3-volume work on Judaism during the period that the Talmud was gestating. Many of his works are studied with Talmudic references. In London, 2 years after Danby's Mishnah appeared, a small group of Jewish scholars headed by Isidore Epstein undertook a project to translate the Talmud into English. The work was interrupted by the war and not completed until 1952. It wasn't the first such project. A highly unsatisfactory late 19th century English translation had been made by Michael Rodkinson, who had moved to the U.S. after being accused of various misdemeanors, including support for the anti-Talmud polemicists. August Rolling, his translation leaves out passages that he felt were irrelevant or of no interest, and he failed to grasp the sense of much of what he was translating. This is not surprising since he spoke very little English. He translated the Talmud into Yiddish and then got school children to render it in English. Kaufman Kohler, a leading Reform scholar, complained that the vandalism perpetrated against the text is unparalleled. Epstein and his team were of a far different caliber. Their scholarly translation appeared in 35 volumes, each with an introduction and concise explanatory notes. The translation was published by the Cincino Press, named after the famous 15th century Italian family of printers. Although its language appears a little archaic now, and its notes can sometimes be as impenetrable as the text they are trying to explain, the Cincino translation functioned for many years as the main study aid for English-speaking Talmud students. The Westminster Talmud. Henry VIII's Talmud had lain virtually untouched in Westminster Abbey for over 4 centuries. At least that's what the few who knew about it thought. In 1956, it was put on display at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Jack Lunser, a collector of ancient manuscripts, saw it and tried to acquire it, but the abbey would not sell. 25 years later, Lunster managed to acquire a medieval copy of Westminster Abbey's founding charter that was on sale in the U.S. He had already agreed with the abbey that if he could acquire the charter, they would swap it for the Talmud. The 9-volume edition, printed by Daniel Bomberg between 1522 and 1538, is now in the Valmadona collection in New York, but it is now transpires the copy of in the abbey may not have belonged to Henry. Each volume has the owner's initials, RB, stamped on it. It was assumed that this stood for either Rex Britannicus, King of Britain, or Rego Bibliothea, the King's Library, but a letter to the Times from Reverend Edward Carpenter, Dean of Westminster, poured cold water on this idea. He pointed out that there was no surviving binding from the Royal Library that bore these initials. According to the Dean, Henry VIII's copy was almost certainly donated by the Old Royal Library to the British Museum in 1757 and is now in the British Library. Subsequent research confirmed by the Valmadona Trust catalog is that the volume belonged to Richard Bruarn, who was Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford. It makes sense. The new Rashi. The last few decades of the 20th century saw the beginning of an explosion in Talmudic learning. More people now studying it than at any other time in history, but it didn't happen overnight. Many reasons have been put forward for the phenomenon, but it wouldn't have happened without a few key people and institutions that were instrumental in making the Talmud letters, and making the Talmud, making the Talmud accessible to everyone. Adin Steinsaltz is one such man. Born in Jerusalem in 1937, Steinsaltz was brought up in a secular home. He studied science at university before embarking on a rabbinic career. His website refers to him as a teacher, philosopher, social critic, and prolific author. He's certainly prolific. He has written over 60 books, but his most significant achievement is his new edition of the Talmud, which he began working on when he was just 27. The problem that Steinsaltz was trying to solve when he decided on a new edition of the Talmud was that the traditional volumes are all based on the late 19th century edition printed in Vilna by the wonderfully named widow and brothers Rome. This, in turn, was based on Bomberg's edition. The text is unpointed. Meaning it has no punctuation or vowels. In Hebrew and Aramaic, vowels are not part of the alphabet. They can be added as marks above or below the letters, but texts for native readers are generally printed without any indication of what the vowels should be. In addition, as befits a 19th century text, the typography, although perfectly legible, is not easy on the eyes as a modern reader is used to. And the commentaries that surround the main text are those of Rashi and the Tosafot, which, although integral to traditional study, are centuries old and difficult for many people to comprehend. Steinsaltz's edition addressed all these problems. He reset the type into modern format and translated the text in either modern Hebrew or English, depending on the edition, weaving his own running commentary into the translation. In addition to the traditional commentaries of Rashi and Tosafot, he explained unusual or difficult words and provided illustrations and scientific explanations where these would be helpful. His printers used 12 different typefaces to help the reader distinguish between the different types of material. In 1988, a 1988 article in Time magazine described Aidan Steinsaltz as a modern Maimonides or Rashi. Over 1 million copies of his Hebrew edition have been sold. A new format of his English edition has recently been produced by Korean publishers, to which they have appended the traditional Vilna page. In Steinsaltz's view, the Talmud is the central pillar of Jewish life, more so than the Bible. If he had his way, rather than teaching the Bible as the key text in Israeli schools, they would teach the Talmud. His opinion carries credibility. He was the youngest ever principal of an Israeli high school at the age of 23. Steinsaltz pioneered the popularization of the Talmud. Some felt he had been too radical, that he had produced an edition of the Talmud for reading rather than for learning. That was certainly the view of the editors of the next major project to make the Talmud accessible to a wider audience. The ArtScroll Talmud reverted to the traditional Hebrew layout, but the facing page included a clear, comprehensible English translation interwoven with a running commentary and detailed notes. When they began to produce their edition of the Talmud, ArtScroll was already a well-established publishing house, specializing in elegantly produced, ideologically certain religious texts. Their success of their Talmud edition is due in part to its visual appeal, but mainly to the clarity with which it communicates and explains the discussion. Apocryphal stories circulate of our ArtScroll readers who cannot understand Hebrew, but can study the Talmud perfectly well using only the English translation. ArtScroll is much more traditional in its outlook than the Steinsaltz edition, belonging more to the yeshiva than to the university. Consequently, it is far more welcome in strictly religious circles. Its use of English is less dense than that of the Sonsino translators, and it is far more dogmatic in its conclusions. It both confuses and challenges its readers less. It excels as a study aid. Its translations are now available in Hebrew, English, and French. The secular Talmud. Printed books are only one of the reasons for the growth in the Talmud's popularity. Revival of religious interest coupled with the worldwide gap year phenomenon has led to a remarkable increase in the number of people studying the Talmud at Israel yeshivot and seminaries. Many school leavers now spend 1, 2, or even 3 years studying before going to university or embarking on a career. Even a casual search on the internet shows just how widespread yeshiva study has become. Hundreds, possibly thousands of sites offer resources for Talmud study. Some contain online lectures or pages of study notes. Others are dedicated to intense Talmudic conversation between students, conducted in patois, virtually unintelligible to outsiders, known as yeshivish. It even has its own dictionary. Chaim Weiser, who compiled the dictionary, describes it as an infusion into English of a lexicon of words from different languages, which are then subject to the rules of English grammar. Yeshivish is the Creole of modern Talmudic student. But the Talmud is no longer the exclusive property of the religious, nor does it just belong to men. The old cultural assumption that education is only for men was set aside generations ago, and even though it is still felt in some circles that the Talmud is a closed book for women, that view is changing fast. There are now many women Talmudic scholars. One of the most striking things about the Talmud, which sets it apart from almost every other religious text, is that one does not have to be a believer in order to study it. It helps, of course, to be familiar with the Bible and religious concepts, but the Talmud is fundamentally an exercise in interpretation and logic. It assumes, but it doesn't demand belief. Very important. Academics have long recognized this. Dozens of universities around the world now have departments devoted to Jewish studies. Talmud is high on the list of the subjects they research and teach. Directly descended from 19th century Wissenschaft movement, the field has broadened considerably. Academic Talmud study today explores the structure, style, and content of the literary units that make up the text, researches parallel sources both within the Talmud and beyond, seeks to clarify the discussions, and sets them within their historical and cultural context. It's no different in form from academic study of any other ancient text. Secular Talmud study isn't just happening in universities. It makes perfect sense to us. Makes perfect sense to us that someone, irrespective of their religious commitment, would want to study the texts that make up their cultural heritage. But it's hard to know what the old, narrowly focused Talmud scholars of the Middle Ages would have made of the most recent development in the Talmudic world. In the mid-1990s, small groups of irreligious Jews, primarily in Israel but also in the U.S., began to gather together to study Talmud from a cultural perspective. In part, this was a quest for identity in a pluralistic world, but for many, it was simply for the enjoyment of coming to grips with a complex, challenging text that they had heard so much about. Since they are not studying in a traditional institution, they are able to be far more creative about the way they engage with the text. And this is where things can get unholy when you start profaning without a scholar. And this is why I always encourage Noahides to make sure you're hanging onto the hem of a garment of a learned rabbi in order to get clear answers on certain matters and know what lines you're not supposed to cross. An Israeli organization dedicated to secular study of the Talmud and other ancient texts uses storytelling, music, art, and creative literature as part of its instructional method. In 2013, Ruth Caldron, the head of a secular Talmud study center, was elected to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. In her maiden speech, she delivered a lecture from the Talmud. She took a moving passage about a woman waiting for her husband to come home, gradually coming to terms with the fact of his death. She turned it into a plea for diversity and mutual respect. Her fellow Knesset members included ultra-religious men who had never heard Talmud taught from a secular perspective, and certainly not from a woman. Her speech became an internet phenomenon. Today, tens of thousands of people attend secular Talmud study groups. In fact, secular Talmud study programs engage more people worldwide than almost any other structured program. The exception is Daf Yomi, the page-a-day program that Meir Shapiro set up in 1924. the 13th cycle. On August 1st, 2012, 93,000 men packed into the MetLife Stadium in New Jersey. They had come to mark the conclusion of the 12th cycle of Daf Yomi. So 7.5 years to read it times 12. It had run continuously since its inauguration in the 1920s. Tens of thousands of men and women attended similar events across the world. The following day, the 13th cycle began. There is no let up in the Daf Yomi, and I think they're on the 14th cycle now. Typically, participants in the Daf Yomi program study together in small groups, making time outside their working day to meet. There are even groups who meet daily on trains as they commute to work. Some sessions take the form of a lecture. Others are made up of people with a similar level of knowledge who work through the text together, often using printed or internet resources to help them. Its popularity belies its grueling schedule. But I love the way that they're using that Daf Yomi approach, even for Noahides, to understand that, hey, there's opportunity for you to plant seeds of community wherever you are with a similar activity. The scale of Daf Yomi's reception is intriguing. For its first half century, it was a fringe activity. Only the most committed took part. In 1975, the conclusion ceremony in New York attracted around 5,000 participants. By 1990, it was 20,000, and in 2013, 93,000 people. Chaim Soloveitchik sees this as an emblematic of contemporary quest for identity. In today's world, our religious or cultural identity is no longer inevitable. We all make cultural choices. Glad you're back, Dave. Turning to Talmud as part of an identity quest is one such choice. But it's not just a matter of identity. There's little doubt that technology has helped fuel the popularity of Daf Yomi program. In the days before the internet, Daf Yomi lectures were recorded on cassette or delivered through telephone line helplines. When the internet came along, its programs were amongst the first experiments in e-learning. Today, when the Daf Yomi participant goes online, she can choose from hundreds of websites containing texts and study guides. Listen to or watch any one of dozens of experts delivering a lecture. And download apps providing every conceivable form of assistance. And when she picks up a volume, where am I? And when she picks up a volume of her tastefully formatted ArtScroll or Korean edition, the traditional burden of laboring in the Talmud is made so much easier. The future. The diversity of those interacting with the Talmud today reflects the pluralist's multicultural world in which we live. What is counterintuitive, however, is that although the content of the Talmud is ancient, it can be construed as anticipating modernity intrinsically situated to the 21st century. Like the internet, the Talmud is a multi-dimensional, nonlinear text in which nearly every line links to content on other pages, creating a web of connections. This is very, very, very unique idea. Like the internet, the Talmud is a multi-dimensional, nonlinear text in which nearly every line links to content on other pages, creating a web of connections and multiple paths for the reader to explore. Very important statement. The core text, which equates to the homepage of a website, links to a hierarchy of on the page commentaries. These connect to a second tier at the back of each volume, exploring the commentaries themselves, and an infinitely expanding tertiary and subsequent levels are contained in separate publications on the Talmudist bookshelves. Unlike the internet, however, the links are not highlighted or underlined on the page. You got to think about it. Yeah, the Talmud hyperlinks are fluid, responsive to the reader's imagination, analytical skills, and subjects of interest, not to the page designer's commercial or creative agenda. And if you've ever worked with a lot of internet material, oh, what an analogy. It's not just the internet. Some Talmudic calculations caused headaches for medieval commentators who struggled to explain the thinking behind them. Mathematicians are now discovering that at least some of the solutions lie in game theory. There's also an aspect of Talmudic decision making which is reminiscent of quantum theory. Science knows that subatomic particles do not occupy a definite state. They are observed. It is the fact of observation which fixes them. There's a category of the problem in Talmud, running out of the house with make sure, which draws on a similar concept. Its solution is known to be one of two possibilities, but each is equally probable. In most cases, the problem can be resolved by reference to an actual case. If the editors of the Talmud have a record of an earlier authority deciding in a particular way, then this becomes the solution to the problem. Very important. But sometimes there is no authority who has already ruled on the problem. In this case, the Talmud remains undecided. The solution exists in two states simultaneously until the end time, when traditionally the prophet Elijah will solve it. The Talmud calls this suspended solution teku, which means let it stand. Very important. A well-known, somewhat extreme illustration of this is the case of a house from which all bread has been removed, as is required for Passover festival. The house is in a state of no longer needing to be cleaned. Then a mouse is seen running into the house with a piece of bread in its mouth. A few moments later, a mouse is seen running out of the house with a piece of bread in its mouth. What is the state of the house now? Do we assume that the same mouse ran in and ran out with the same piece of bread in its mouth, and now the house is in its state of no longer needing to be cleaned? Or do we assume that a different mouse ran out with a different piece of bread, the original mouse and its bread still being in the house, so that it is now in a state of needing to be cleaned? Each case is equally probable. The problem was posed long before there was any forensic way of testing whether two different mice had been in the house. The Talmud declares teku, let the problem remain undecided. Technically, the house now exists in two different states simultaneously. This is so key to understand, folks, because it'll help you understand rabbinical decisions. Come on, you. It will only assume a final state of needing to be cleaned or not needing to be cleaned when Elijah observes it. Just as an unobserved subatomic particle will only have its state fixed when someone observes it, and that's due to the uncertainty principle. Of the many cultures with which the Talmud has come into contact in its 1,500-year history, perhaps the most unusual has been the experience in South Korea. There, the Talmud has been adopted as a primary school text. When news first emerged that South Korea children were studying the Talmud and that every Korean home has a copy, it was greeted with disbelief. If it had to be a spoof. After all, adults struggle to understand the Talmud, let alone children, and most Jewish homes don't have a copy. So why would all Korean families possess one? As befits the Talmudic narrative, the reports are both true and false. It all depends on how you understand them. Korean children are studying the Talmud, and there are apparently copies in every home. But it's not the multi-volume, 2 million word densely argued version. It's a highly abridged version containing some of the stories and ethical teachings from the Talmud. Aspirational Koreans appreciate that the Talmud study is an effective way of training the mind in problem solving. Combining its cut and thrust methods of debate with the more rigid Confucian methods of teaching gives Korean students a multidimensional educational experience that is unheard of anywhere else in the world. It's nearly 2,000 years since the first discussions in the Babylonian academies. The Talmud's history has been long and eventful. There's no knowing what will come next. There's no doubt that it will continue to be studied. There's no doubt that it will continue to be studied, and if the trend of the last half century are anything to go by, the number of people pouring through its tomes will continue to increase for some while yet, and it will continue to reach new audiences, particularly if the South Korean experience is anything to go by. We can't know for certain where the Talmud can go, but for now, at least, it's no longer the exclusive property of the yeshiva, even though come on, you. Story. Okay. The Talmud study is an effective way of training the mind. Okay, we went through that. Even though, come on, you. I know there's something wrong with my mouse. I need to go buy a new mouse. Talmud study is effective. Aspirational Koreans appreciate that Talmud study is where it will continue to challenge minds and provoke discussion the most. The people who created the Talmud conquered no empires, nor did they build fine palaces to display their grandeur. Those who nurtured it and preserved it from the flames were not honored by kings and princes. Nobody wrote ballads in their name. They received neither estates nor wealth for their trouble. The students whose eyes grew dim through long hours, days and nights of study did not do so for the sake of personal gain, not in this world at any rate. But between them, they all created a pillar of world literature, a testament to the power of the human mind. Not every knee will consider it sacred literature. Most will find it too dense to spend much time with, but it stands amongst the great classics of scholarly endeavor. It has had its fill of suffering, but its worldview is optimistic. Its story has a long way to run. And I think that's the end of the book. That's the end of the book, The Talmud, a biography. And for those of you that have tuned in to listen to it, we're so grateful that you did attend. And thank you for being with us. And I think that we're going to conclude that for Rocky Mountain Readings for today. If anybody's got suggestions on something they want me to read next, let me know. I'm at that stage where I got lots on my plate. I may have to put these aside for now. I don't know. Give me some feedback, people, so I know what you'd like. But it's been a joy to read this book. I love the history behind it and everything else that it poured out to actually give us an overview. And you can see the sensitivity of the scholastic work of the Talmud. It affected, it just rubbed so many people the wrong way because it must have held some lots and lots and lots of truth. No doubt. I love the way they describe its underpinnings from the beginning and the way the arguments debated and the way everything was laid out. But I love those few analogies that came out in the end. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful stuff. So, we're going to sign out of Rocky Mountain Readings for today. And until I pick a new book, back. Thank you for tuning in. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, everybody.